While Sue's hooking up her laptop, I know she's most nervous about me introducing her because I know many stories. Um, and I thought of one to tell, but I won't because, well, I just won't. But Sue and I go way back to one of my very first networking job, actually Susan as well. For a while there was, at University of Michigan, there was Susan R. Harris, Susan P. Harris, and Susan Hares. And for the longest time I thought they were all her. So in a meeting I exclaimed, how could you do all these things? How can you write the campus newsletter and all these things? As it turns out, it was 3 people, so I was a little relieved. But anyway, Sue's the reason that I got my first engineering job. She probably doesn't remember, but I've always been appreciative of the lies she told to get it for me. And she's here to give a talk. It's true, it's so true. But it was all in the spirit of getting me to help her fix routing problems so that she could go on to, the routing registry stuff and making the NSF net safe. So anyway, are you hooked up? Oh, cool. Well, here's Sue.
So, first of all, I started all of this, and kudos to our previous speaker and to Randy and his panel, because maybe this talk is now not as well needed, which is why we tried to cut some of the time period. But so I'm going to try to pull out a few points, because the way I got started in this talk is, why should we talk about BGP attacks? There's a couple things when I was looking at BGP, and as the co-chair, people have asked me, how serious do we have to take into account the BGP security? In the ITF, the security ADs have wanted us to really be rigorous in our look, and I wanted to find the real-world problems, because if you don't have real-world problems, you're building code that's for pie in the sky or something. Okay, so one thing that I've been pressed on is how real are these security concerns from the government? And one thing is, Steve alluded to the fact that they have started to really take a look at it, and I actually found a couple interesting quotes. After the attack on the root servers in October, there was a quote from one of the people, Schmidt, from the U.S. government, that says, "We're looking for institutionalizing the standard protocols for communicating back and forth between the root server protocol and the U.S. government," aka watch out, they're coming for that. And then there's another one that talks about, in February, they have a strategy to secure cyberspace whose goal is to engage, empower Americans to secure portions of cyberspace that they own, operate, or control, or which they interact. If that isn't the routing infrastructure, I don't know what it is, and it does actually specify BGP protocols and DNS protocols, and it's a 1 to 5 year plan. So in case you didn't think the government actually had comments on this, and I'm sure Ross will go on to more fun comments, but I actually found those on public websites, and there are people looking at it. So as I went forward, I started this to try to have a panel of people standing up and saying, like Rob, I got a real problem here, I'll tell you what it is, and I fixed it in my network. That's not what I got. I got a lot of quiet. So I'm here with the ITF saying, gee, you gotta really secure it, and I wanna say, only if you do infrastructure. Well, we've talked about this in the NANOG steering committee, and I think Curtis, when we talked about the review of the previous slide and tried to give you some real comments about what the vulnerabilities were, what could happen, where should you look, what you should do, came up with one of the best quotes. It's the disservice to the community to talk about the existing exposures without being specific about what those exposures are. There's always only the good guys factor, but that only goes so far. In reality, you have to tell the good guys first. And I think in the context of looking at vulnerabilities, it's hard for us to talk about them unless we actually have fixes, because as last time Steve gave his talk, attacks followed. And so I understand people not talking about it, And I understand that there might be a reality where it's not your most pressing attack. As our previous speaker said, you know, attacking with TCP SYNs and various things might not be as easy as just getting a compromised router password. So that's why Eric and Bill say there aren't really any attacks. And VJ said, well, we have some things that the BCP could fix. You know, there's this high amount of prefixes. And again, I'm pleading, one of the normal reasons is you misconfigure the routers. And you don't have your maximum prefix filters or prefix filters set. There are SYN floods to port 179. And is it an attack? Well, our last speaker went into that. Please take a look at it. Internal multi-hop BGPs, which are hijacked and inject bad routes, which is a variant on compromising bad routers, it's another thing, may be caused by those clear text passwords. I know in a last presentation, we showed you how many clear text passwords we can find in this room at a NANOG wireless. Perhaps we ought to think about that. And, you know, there are things that can be done. Multi-hop BGP over IPsec, and Dave Ward did some really good work in how to talk about IPsec, and you'll find that in the thing. Now, Susan, I apologize for this not being in the notes, but a couple of these notes I got just on the comment that they wouldn't go in the notes. So this is a case that Rob Thomas went over this morning, I think, when he talked to you, but I want to re-emphasize that, you know, if they're purchasing compromised BGP routers, you've heard a whole bunch today about fixing your router security, putting filters on prefix. So we don't mean to be unhelpful in the NANOG, but to say, come on, get back on the things that we know how to do the BCPs. The next thing is miscreants using BGP speaker routers to know their enemies, especially other miscreants. They'll make bogus announcements and sort of spoof you. So what's going to happen? Okay, now, not all BGP is in ISPs, but there's a lot of BGP in enterprises. And I talked to Mike, who works with enterprises, and I've actually talked to enterprises. And you start to talk about them in different places and say, BGP attacks and attacks. And they say, huh, what does it matter? You know, but I think if we begin to socialize the routing registry, we may get people past, huh. And that's probably what we're trying to do here. So remember that attacks go, when I talk to people, and I'd really, really like to hear more specifics, in my ITF chair hat, and I'm sure Randy and I'm sure Steve would like to hear pieces about real attacks, because then we can weight solutions. You know, attacks go after the infrastructure, deployed boxes, BGP vulnerabilities, deployment issues, you know, not getting your RPF checks. But one thing that Dave Myers says continually is 90% of the problems that he sees are still misconfiguration or reconfigurations of routers. The questions that eventually, when we get past the oops, I screwed up, or this happened because it's inconsistent, are some of these due to attacks? And I think at that point, I'll page you up on yours.
Yeah, well, a lot of what I was going to say about misconfigurations, subverted routers, and some evil originators has already been said. I won't go into much more than that, except to wonder if some of the hackers are being paid with Nigerian bank accounts. You know, we all know about misconfiguration. We all know about AS7007. I'll mention one other incident. About 4 years, 3-4 years ago, AT&T WorldNet was off the air long enough that it made the Wall Street Journal. I had the fun of conversations with very high executives in the company explaining that it was a BGP problem originating in some other ISP was announcing a /24 that we were utterly relying on for our infrastructure. And it caused problems. You know, this is a threat model that CEOs and CTOs understand, appearing in the Wall Street Journal. Many, many less noticed attacks. Some of them. I had the thrill of explaining to other high executives quite recently about BGP hijacking. Spammers, well, you know, FTC found that 2/3 of spam seems to be illegal. Committing one felony is the second one free. It's not just minor ISPs, it's major ones that has to have. It's happening today. The threat that has always worried me the most, I've just told some of you that, these days, I first got into worrying about internet security by thinking about routing security back in '86. That's when I started worrying about this, trying to run a very small intranet within Bell Labs. You hijack two routers in some fashion, one near either end of a connection. From one of them, you announce a better route to the destination. You set up a tunnel to a monitoring station or connection hijacking station. Set up a GRE tunnel to the other hijacked router that's closer to the destination, so you're re-injecting the traffic correctly. And unless someone's monitoring the route very carefully, they're not going to notice what's going on. Do your customers monitor path changes, not just AS path, but actual path changes, and filter it out from the noise? Do you? And this is not hypothetical, this is happening today. I have been very reliably informed that this has been observed in the wild by some customers who care about such things. This is not, so I'm not speaking here hypothetically. This has always been one of the more serious cases. And yeah, they can do end-to-end encryption to hide the actual content of the traffic. But there's a lot of stuff that a lot of people can't afford to encrypt. The spammers are a nuisance attacker in some sense, but of course that's a threat model we all understand. There's a lot of traffic that we don't really want to be carried, if not well, the reason that our customers don't like getting it. More serious enemies can do more serious damage. The major hijackings, the AS7007 incident, the AT&T WorldNet incident, are easy to notice and correct because lots of people are screaming and got lots of red lights and alarms inside your NOC. The smaller scale ones affecting a few prefixes are much more deadly and can be much harder to spot because no one is looking for this. Today's defenses can't even cope with today's attacks. What's coming tomorrow? Your first approximation. Everyone's vulnerable. So what do we do about it?
So one of the things I wanted to note from everybody to highlight, we have a large amount of misconfiguration. I think one of the things we've got to look at, and I'd like to hear, and this is what this is a plea to try to get comments about BGP problems. Okay, I've given up trying to get people to talk publicly. VJ was brave enough to give that at ITF. Talk to myself, talk to Steve, talk to someone so we can find out, because I think we've got to minimize these costs of having BGP infrastructure outages. So I'll be in the back, or Randy will probably make comments now. Go ahead, Randy.
Randy Bush, let me make the real explicit. I worked for a very large vendor, or a very large ISP. The routers were all secured with SSH. One of the funny things about large ISPs is the fact we have a lot of people who have to have a lot of access to routers. We use TACACS or Radius. So therefore you get the password to one of them, you get the password to all of them. We had a relationship with an external party, a router vendor in this case, who had access to our routers for specific testing purposes. They had a disgruntled employee that got behind their firewall, had a machine that had legitimate access to our network. All our routers were exposed. The miscreant was stupid enough to change one silly thing in the configuration that the hourly rancid router suite caught, and if you don't choose rancid, you're silly. And we figured it out and shut it all off. But just to be clear, I am standing here saying, first person, these things happen and happen on a large scale.
So I guess the end of the talk is whisper to one of us, talk to us about it. We'll try to give general tutorials, as Randy has mentioned, as the program committee has mentioned, to give you the tools to fight this, but it's a problem today. Please give us information so we can disseminate best practices. Okay. Susan, I think that's it.